The house was too quiet for a place that large. Beyond the hedges on Hillside Avenue, a Victorian mansion sat with every blind drawn, a cavern of dark windows looking back at the neighborhood like empty eyes. Inside, the air was stale, a stillness you can hear. Mail piled on the doorstep, milk soured on the back steps. The lights that once warmed the rooms were dead, but somewhere in the belly of the home, the faintest echo of church music seemed to float and fall, as if the walls themselves were remembering a hymn. Westfield, New Jersey, November 1971. A family known for punctual church attendance and polite small talk had simply ceased to appear. The father, always neat, always formal, had stopped waving at the neighbors during his morning drive. The children, who should have been drifting from class to after-school rehearsals and ball practice, were suddenly absent. Curtains stayed closed through noon and evening, and every night after that. On the 29th day, officers forced the door. What they saw did not look like a crime of rage. It looked like a ceremony interrupted. Bodies carefully gathered under the ballroom skylight, coats folded, a rug drawn like a veil. A note on the desk in a steady, educated hand, addressed not to the police or the papers, but to a pastor. Upstairs, a mother laid where she had fallen. Order inside horror. Calm inside catastrophe. It is the kind of tableau that turns even a seasoned detective into a quiet man. For nearly a month, 5 people had been missing in plain sight, held not only by death, but by the appearance of normalcy that had shielded them for years. The neighbors had heard nothing. The teachers had suspected nothing. The bank had asked nothing that could not be answered with a nod and a signature. Someone had planned for silence, and the plan had worked. His name was John Emil List. He was not a shadow at the window or a pair of boots in the mud behind the house. He was the homeowner, the husband, the father, the man who locked the door behind him and walked away. Before we talk about how he became a fugitive for 18 years, we have to ask a simpler question that refuses to be simple. How does a man decide that salvation requires murder? Before the silence, before the hymn, there was order, the kind of order John List believed kept the world from falling apart. Every morning began with pressed shirts, buttered toast, and a whispered grace before breakfast. Helen, his wife, moved slower these days, always with a cigarette between her fingers, her voice roughened by alcohol and regret. Their children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, filled the grand Victorian house with the kind of noise that once made it feel alive. To the neighbors, they were the embodiment of suburban virtue, polite, religious, dependable. To John List, they were a reflection of his discipline and faith proof that he had built a family that pleased God. In 1965, he moved them into Breeze Knoll, an 18-room mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. It was elegant, spacious, and much too expensive. But to John, it symbolized divine approval, a tangible sign that he had done things the right way. Even as his career faltered and debts grew, he insisted on maintaining the image of prosperity. Every morning he dressed in his suit, carried his briefcase, and left for work as if nothing had changed. The truth was that he no longer had a job to go to. Helen had stopped pretending. She had once been lively and beautiful, but years of illness and bitterness had stripped that away. She drank early in the day, medicated herself into numbness, and lashed out when she was awake. She taunted him about his faith, his failures, the dullness of his personality. "You're no man of God," she would hiss. "You're a nobody with a Bible." To a man raised to see order as righteousness, that humiliation was poison. John endured it in silence, hiding behind prayer, but the resentment festered beneath his calm. Their daughter Patricia had inherited Helen's defiance and John's intelligence, a dangerous combination. At 16, she announced she wanted to become an actress. John froze at the dinner table, fork suspended midair. Acting to him was lying, and lying was the devil's work. From that night, the house filled with the heavy quiet of unspoken contempt. Patricia told friends her father was going crazy. She wasn't wrong. Still, every Sunday, the Lists appeared at church in perfect formation. John led the way, Helen followed behind, and the children walked in a neat row. They sat in the same pew each week, hands folded, faces serene. But John's prayers had changed. He no longer prayed for patience or for his wife's recovery. He prayed for clarity. He prayed for a way to protect his family, even if it meant doing something the world would never understand. At night, when the house had gone quiet, he would sit in his study and listen to old hymns on the record player. The melodies drifted through the dark hallways, brushing against the framed portraits of smiling faces that no longer spoke to one another. He kept his Bible open beside his ledger, numbers and verses blurring together. He told himself that God would forgive him for what he was planning. After all, he wasn't killing out of hate. He was saving them from damnation, from shame, from a world that had forgotten God entirely. In the photographs taken just months before the murders, the family still smiled. Patricia's eyes looked tired, Helen's smile didn't quite reach her cheeks, and John's gaze was fixed somewhere far away. The picture captured what no one else could see: a man who had already made peace with the unthinkable. Beneath the polished surface of a perfect home, something sacred had broken. The father who built that house had decided that if he could not keep it holy, he would end it himself. By the autumn of 1971, the walls of Breeze Knoll had grown silent, heavy with tension. The laughter that once echoed through its long corridors had been replaced by footsteps, whispers, and the sound of a clock that seemed to tick louder every day. John List had lost his job months earlier, but he couldn't bring himself to tell anyone. Each morning, he dressed in his dark suit, carried his briefcase, and walked out the door as if everything were still in order. The truth was that he drove to the train station, parked, and spent his days sitting alone, reading his Bible, staring into nothing. He had been raised to believe that a man who couldn't provide for his family was worthless in the eyes of both society and God. The pressure of that belief crushed him. The bills were piling up. The bank had begun to call. Helen's drinking and cruelty deepened. She taunted him about his failures, about how her first husband had been a real man, a soldier, not a bookkeeper. Patricia barely looked at him anymore except when she rolled her eyes. Even his mother, once his source of comfort, had begun to ask questions about money. John saw every word of criticism as proof that God was testing him, that he had been chosen to endure humiliation for a greater purpose. But in his twisted logic, endurance became justification. He started to believe that God was not merely testing him, God was commanding him. He would sit in the study late into the night, the Bible open beside a stack of unpaid bills, the faint music of hymns filling the room. The same verses called to him again and again: sin, salvation, sacrifice. He began to write notes to himself, rationalizing the idea that physical death might be a form of spiritual rescue. The idea grew quietly, like rot beneath polished wood. He told himself that his family had drifted too far from God. Helen with her bitterness, Patricia chasing a life on stage, John Jr. questioning his authority. They were on a path to damnation. But if he could end their lives while they were still innocent enough to be forgiven, their souls could be saved. It was not murder, he told himself, it was mercy. The last piece of his delusion fell into place when the bank threatened foreclosure. To lose the house, to face public shame, would be to prove to everyone that he had failed, and failure, to John List, was sin. His faith had warped into a mirror of his pride. He would rather destroy everything than be seen as weak. On a cold November evening, he wrote a letter to his pastor. He confessed his duty and begged for understanding. "I couldn't let them suffer," he wrote. "I know that now they are in heaven, and someday I will join them if God wills it." In the days that followed, John prepared meticulously. He canceled the mail, stopped the milk delivery, and closed the family bank accounts. He sharpened his resolve with scripture and silence. By the time he laid his suit out on the 9th of November 1971, his mind was frighteningly calm. He believed the decision had already been made, not by him, but by God. And so, in that quiet house on Hillside Avenue, a devout man convinced himself that his family was an act of faith. He prayed for their forgiveness, but not for their survival. The father who once built his life on obedience was ready to break every commandment in the name of God. Morning broke cold and gray over Westfield on November 9th, 1971. John List woke before sunrise. He ironed his suit, shined his shoes, and placed a handgun and a .22 caliber rifle on his desk, side by side like sacred instruments. Downstairs, the house was still, the smell of coffee faint under the dust of neglect. He moved quietly through the halls, every step rehearsed in his mind for weeks. His first stop was the third floor, his mother's room. Alma was 84, fragile and devoted to her son. She trusted him completely. When he stepped through the door, she smiled and asked about breakfast. He leaned forward, kissed her cheek, and then shot her in the temple. One quick, deliberate She fell before she could speak. He whispered a prayer over her body and covered her with a towel. Then he walked down to the kitchen where Helen sat in her robe, sipping coffee, the tremor of alcohol still in her hands. "Good morning," he said softly. She turned to answer, unaware of the pistol rising in his hand. One the jaw she instantly, slumping over the table. John caught her before she fell, as if afraid of making a mess. He wiped the blood from the floor, then dragged her to a sleeping bag and laid her in the ballroom. He knew the children would be home soon, and he wanted everything to be perfect. He played a record of organ hymns on the stereo, their hollow tones echoing through the house like a requiem. The music would mask the noise of gunfire, he thought, and bring peace to their final moments. Patricia was the first to return from school. She stepped through the front door, dropping her bag by the stairs. Her father was waiting. When she saw the expression on his face, she froze. "Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. He raised the head. She fell instantly. He carried her to the ballroom and laid her beside her mother, arranging their hands neatly across their chests. A few hours later, his youngest son, Frederick, came home. The same ritual followed, one prayer, one careful placement. John moved slowly, methodically, without rage or hesitation. To him, this was not murder. It was duty fulfilled. That evening, his eldest son, John Jr., came home from soccer practice. He was 17, tall and strong, the only one who might have fought back. John met him in the kitchen. The boy's confusion turned to panic when he saw his father's gun. They struggled. John once, twice, then 3 more times before his son stopped moving. Later, he would tell police that John Jr. was and I didn't want him to suffer. He fought to make sure. When it was over, the house smelled of gunpowder and hymn wax. He dragged the last to the ballroom and lined them all in a row beneath the glass skylight. Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. His mother remained upstairs, in her room, untouched by the ritual below. He turned off the record player and began cleaning. He washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and vacuumed the carpet where blood had. Then he sat at his desk and wrote a 5-page confession to his pastor, explaining everything. He wrote that he could no longer see his family suffer in a world of sin, that sending them to God was an act of mercy. "I am sure they are in heaven now," he ended, "and if things go as planned, I will be too." He sealed the envelope, left it beside the place, and took one last walk through the house. In the ballroom beneath the dim chandelier, the family lay in perfect order. He whispered a final prayer and turned off the lights. As he locked the door behind him, John List didn't look back. The house was silent again, except for the slow fade of the hymn still echoing from the record player. And for nearly a month, no one would notice. After locking the front door of Breeze Knoll, John List walked away as though he were leaving for work. The chill of November bit through his coat, but his mind was strangely calm. He drove his Chevrolet to the airport, parked it in a long-term lot, and then vanished. There was no note to the police, no goodbye to neighbors, only the echo of hymns fading inside the empty mansion. For the first few days, no one noticed anything unusual. The List family was quiet, respectable, not the sort to draw attention. When letters to the children's schools arrived saying they'd be traveling for a while, teachers accepted it. The milk delivery was canceled, the mail stopped, and John's methodical planning kept the house frozen in time. Inside, the ballroom remained locked in silence, 5 bottles lined under a skylight, a tableau of twisted devotion preserved by the cold November air. It took nearly a month before anyone grew suspicious. The neighbors finally called the police after noticing the lights had been left on night and day, the bulbs slowly burning out one by one. When officers broke down the door, the smell of decay rolled through the hall. The house was cold, the stereo still humming faintly. On the desk, they found his letter, 5 pages of calm handwriting that explained, almost logically, why he had released his family to God. It wasn't the scrawl of a madman, it was the report of an accountant. By then, John List was hundreds of miles away. He had taken a train to Denver, Colorado, where he created a new identity, Robert P. Clark. He obtained false documents, took an accounting job at a small paper company, and began attending church again, sitting quietly among the faithful as if nothing had happened. He joined a Lutheran congregation, sang hymns, even led Bible study. Eventually, he remarried a devout woman named Dolores and moved with her to Virginia. He was polite, disciplined, reliable, the very qualities that had once hidden his darkness. 18 years passed. The mansion he left behind, Breeze Knoll, was later destroyed in a mysterious fire. No one ever rebuilt it. Only the foundation remained, like a scar in the earth. The case went cold. There were no fingerprints, no financial trail, no body of the suspect. For nearly 2 decades, John List became a ghost in plain sight. In 1989, the producers of America's Most Wanted decided to revive the case. They worked with forensic artist Frank Bender to create a lifelike clay bust, a aged progression sculpture, predicting what List might look like after 18 years on the run. Bender studied old photos, List's skull structure, his personality, even his meticulous habits. He gave the sculpture rimmed glasses, a receding hairline, and a reserved, tight-lipped expression, the face of a man who hid behind order. When the episode aired on the 21st of May 1989, millions watched. Among them was a woman in Richmond, Virginia, a neighbor of Robert Clark. She froze. The man on her screen wasn't a stranger. It was the quiet churchgoer who lived down the street. Within days, police surrounded Clark's house. When confronted, John List denied everything, but fingerprints told the truth. He was extradited to New Jersey and put on trial in 1990. The courtroom was packed with journalists, psychologists, and curious onlookers trying to see what evil looked like when dressed in a gray suit. John sat motionless as prosecutors described each killing. He never raised his voice. He never wept. When asked why, he simply said, "I couldn't bear to see them suffer. I thought I was saving them from hell." The jury took less than 9 hours to convict him on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge called him without remorse, without humanity, and without excuse. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. When reporters asked if he regretted it, he said quietly, "I feel sorrow for what happened, but I believe all of us will be together again in heaven." John List spent the rest of his life behind bars. He attended prison church services and continued to insist that he had done God's will. The man who once walked out of his mansion into the cold November air never walked free again. In 2008, he died in prison at the age of 82. No family came to claim the body. The man who had preserved his perfect image was buried under a simple stone, anonymous, forgotten, erased. When the cell door closed on John List for the last time, it didn't just end a life, it sealed a symbol. The case of John List became one of those American tragedies that never quite fade, whispered whenever people spoke about faith, pride, and the quiet danger of appearances. He wasn't a man who killed in a fit of passion or madness. He killed out of cold conviction, convinced that order mattered more than love, that God demanded perfection, even if it meant death. The mansion he left behind, Breeze Knoll, was demolished long ago, its foundations swallowed by weeds. Where once stood a monument to respectability, there is now only an empty lot, a quiet patch of ground that locals still avoid at night. Neighbors say the place feels hollow, like something was taken from it that never returned. Some remember the organ hymns that echoed from that house, playing for weeks after the murders, a broken record singing to no one. Decades later, the John List case is still studied in psychology courses and criminal profiling programs. He has become the blueprint of a family annihilator, a man who destroys his own household, not out of hatred, but out of a warped sense of duty. Experts describe 4 motives common to such killers: financial ruin, perceived shame, loss of control, and a delusional belief that killing is a form of mercy. John List embodied all 4. He saw himself as the last moral man in a decaying world, and when the world disappointed him, he remade it in blood. In interviews before his death, he spoke softly, almost politely, about what he had done. There was no anger, no thrill, no remorse, just logic. He said that if he could, he would do it differently, but not necessarily undo it. "I wish there had been another way," he murmured, "but I still believe they're in a better place." Those words chilled investigators more than the murders themselves, because they revealed the one truth about John List that never changed. He always needed to be right. Even in damnation, he wanted control. For the families who lost them, there were no graves to visit together, no peace to be made. The Lists had been buried apart, their name erased from local directories, their story reduced to a cautionary tale told in documentaries and crime shows. But their faces frozen in the family portrait taken months before the murders continue to haunt anyone who studies the case. The smiles look almost normal, almost warm, yet something in John's expression betrays the truth. A man desperate to hold together the illusion of a perfect life already slipping through his fingers. In the end, John List's greatest deception was not the month he kept his family's death secret, nor the 18 years he lived as someone else. It was the lie he told himself that murder could ever be redemption, that faith could ever justify cruelty, that control could ever replace love. He built a home to prove his devotion, then destroyed it to prove his righteousness. And now, Breeze Knoll stands only in memory, the house of hymns and ghosts, a reminder that evil often wears a pressed suit and a polite smile. In the soft echo of those hymns, one can still hear the question that has never found an answer. How does a man who prays for salvation become the instrument of his family's destruction?